So it's lovely to be here this evening. As Annette mentioned, my name is Barbara Whelan and I'm a co-founder of Silent Voices, which is an initiative of Alcohol Action Ireland. And it was started in January in order to end the silence on the impact of growing up with parental alcohol misuse. And we estimate that there are approximately 400,000 adults in Ireland who grew up with parental alcohol misuse, and that there's an estimated 200,000 children currently growing up with parental alcohol misuse. So that's approximately 600,000 people out of a population of 4.9 million. And we'd really like to thank Dr. Katie Baird for agreeing to co-present this lecture, and we're very, very appreciative of the support for our initiative. So this evening's lecture focuses on the impact that growing up with parental alcohol misuse has on mental health, and most importantly, on things that can help. And by way of background information, as Annette mentioned, I did grow up with parental alcohol misuse. One of my parents was alcohol dependent, and it had a devastating impact on my mental health. I've suffered from anxiety all my life. My earliest memories are of getting sick before going to school in the morning. As a teenager, I was crippled with shyness, and looking back, I realised I was suffering from depression. And then in my early 20s, I had a lot of difficulties with panic attacks. Lurking underneath there was depression. And in my early 40s, a period of stress built up in my life. Things got triggered, my past came back to haunt me, and I went through an extended period of mental ill health. But along the way, a professional asked me, would there have been something that would have enabled me to access help at an earlier stage than I did? And without hesitating, I said two things. One, if there had been a Pieta house near me, somewhere where I could have fallen in the door and just said, there's something wrong, I need help, but I don't want medication. I'm not against medication, I did take it for a while and needed it, but like many who've grown up with parental alcohol misuse, I have a deep fear of addiction, and I needed quite a lot of reassurance around taking it. And the other thing would have been if I had read something about how people who've grown up with parental alcohol use commonly feel about themselves. I think I would have recognised that and gone for help at an earlier stage than I did. And that's why I'm here this evening, in the hope that someone listening to me this evening, or indeed back online, may begin to realise that there might be a connection between current difficulties we have in our life and the experience of growing up with parental alcohol misuse. And what I'm simply going to do is to offer you my experience of things that have helped me. And while I can't promise that there'll be something for everyone in the audience, I really do hope that there will be something for someone in the audience. So quite a big breakthrough came for me when I came across a book about children of alcoholics, and I began to realise where my own difficulties might lie. And at the end of the book, there was a list of places where you might go for help, and it also spoke a little bit about psychotherapy and counselling, and that's the route that I took. So in a nutshell, therapy for me was a place where I learned to trust again. And I think it was the experience of being deeply respected that enabled me to trust my therapist, and the experience of being deeply accepted that in time began to chip away at things. And I found that just telling someone what had happened to me in my life really broke through an awful lot of the self-blame that I carried at that time. And it was a place where I dealt with anger, where I grieved for the loss of a childhood, for things I never had and could now never have. And the late Anya Tubridy, in her wonderful book, When Panic Attacks, has a line which has stayed with me. And she wrote, alcohol robs childhoods, and it does. So in these few lines, I tried to capture the importance of that therapeutic relationship in my own recovery from depression. I remember that sacred space, that sparsely furnished room with no statue or icon, incense or relic, just chairs to sit on as two gathered together, one blessed with the gift of hearing. Well, on the one hand, I will say that I wouldn't be as well as I am today, but for the good therapy I had. I will also say that it only got me to the starting blocks. As we know, when we've had a few episodes of depression and a few relapses, things get triggered much, much more easily. And when they do, they unravel very quickly. It seems as if life becomes a big game of snakes and ladders, except the snakes get a bit longer and the ladders get a bit shorter. So staying well can be quite a struggle. And I found that to build on the good therapy I had, I needed to learn tools and skills in order to self-maintain and to reduce the risk of slipping back into depression. So I've tried several things, including CBT or cognitive-based therapy. CBT didn't work for me, but just because it didn't work for me doesn't mean it wouldn't work for you. I think that different things work for different people, and also different things might work for us at different times in our life. But I remember when I was working with a psychologist doing CBT, anytime she challenged anything negative, I would say, I just felt that she was denying my experience. And on the inside, it felt quite painful, even though I knew it wasn't intended. And also I found then when I became aware of being self-critical, that I started to get into a loop of being critical of myself. So I really found I was struggling with it. But I went out and bought a book called CBT for Dummies on the basis that you couldn't get anything more basic than that. And I found the reason why CBT wasn't working for me in the first line, in the introduction to the first chapter. And it said, you feel the way you think. And I looked at it and thought, no, I don't. I think the way I feel. And what happens for me is that an old emotional memory gets triggered, and it seems to worm its way up into my brain, at which stage the negative thinking starts. So while of course there is an interaction between our thoughts and our feelings, sometimes the problem has more to do with how we feel about ourselves than what we think about ourselves. So what I have found very helpful in keeping well, and which I think has a lot to offer children of alcoholics, is mindfulness meditation. And Aware has some really good information on mindfulness on their website. And in addition, there have been a number of very good lectures on the subject. And from going through them, the consensus among the professionals seems to be that there's a right time to start mindfulness. So if you're experiencing difficulties in your life right now, it's probably better to wait until things ease a little before you start. And also in the early days, I was also going for psychotherapy when I was practicing mindfulness. And I found that very helpful because when things began to emerge in meditation, I had a place where I could process all that. And looking back, I think certainly that mindfulness enhanced therapy, but most definitely therapy enhanced mindfulness, because it gave me a huge amount of self-awareness to work with as I moved on with my life subsequently. So I don't have too much time to talk about mindfulness in depth, but I'll just give you one or two examples from my own practice to illustrate what I mean when I say there might be something in it for us. At one stage, my therapist said to me, or at least my GP said to me, that I have the ability to function at quite a high level, even though I'm unwell. And while that can be an advantage, in that it can mean perhaps you can continue to hold down a job or, continue with social activities. The downside for me is that I tend to bottle things up, soldier on, and then like an avalanche, plunge into depression. So I need to become aware at a much earlier stage than I normally do of when things are going pear-shaped. So meditating every day just enables me to keep a light check on things. But I have also found it powerfully healing of all the denial that I've experienced growing up with parental alcohol misuse. When you sit there, just allowing yourself to feel whatever it is you're feeling in any given moment, the only way I can describe it is, it's like a part of you sits up and says, thank you for noticing me. Another example, I decided at one stage to empty the dishwasher mindfully as a way of easing the agitation of anxiety. And after a while, I began to look forward to the task. And then one evening, I was bending down to take a dinner plate out of the dishwasher when the image of bending down to lift a small child into my arms came into my mind. And when you do something physically mindfully, you do it physically slowly. And when you do something physically slowly, you do it physically gently. And it's gradually, the mind begins to follow suit. And the thing that I have found in mindfulness, which I haven't found elsewhere, is that it's a deeply respectful and a very, very gentle practice. And I often think that gentleness is the antidote to our fear. And it seems to have benefits for those of us whose depression originates in childhood adversity. And I have no qualifications in mindfulness, but I have been practicing it for 15 years. And from that practice, I think that one of the reasons why it may work is that it is a psychological practice which contains within it the seeds of a healing practice. And by that I mean is that it gives us very, very valuable psychological tools, but after a while it begins to work at a deeper level. And I think it begins to start to heal the wounds from which the depression originates in the first place. So it's as if that vicious cycle, which ends up in depression, gradually begins to shift and turn and become a more virtuous cycle. The only thing I would say about mindfulness, though, just as a last word in relation to it, is that that process does take time. So I think that I found it gave me quite useful tools quite quickly, but it wasn't really until I'd been practicing for a number of years that I became aware of the deeper healing taking place. So with mindfulness, I think it can be useful to think of it in terms of mindfulness and rather than mindfulness or. So at one stage for me it was mindfulness and therapy, another stage it was mindfulness and medication, and now it's just compassionate mindfulness. So this is a lovely extract from a guided meditation by Mark Williams. And Mark Williams was one of the founders of MBCT, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And I remember when I heard it for the first time, feeling really emotional, because it felt as if that last line, and just remember that all beings includes you, had been written for me. And of course it was, for me and for all of us who go through life dogged with that sense of always being on the outside looking in, of never really belonging. And last word on mindfulness, I have no idea why when they developed MBCT, they decided to call it mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, because this is my experience of it. HBAT, heartfulness-based effective therapy. In my experience, mindfulness has much more to do with the heart than the mind, and much more to do with feeling than thinking. So here we have a quip from the Dalai Lama, love your neighbour as yourself, pity my neighbour. But like all quips, though it does contain an element of the truth, it doesn't contain the whole truth. The reality is that children of alcoholics can be very compassionate towards others. And I recently came across some research which indicates that children of alcoholics are overrepresented in the healthcare professions. It's not surprising given that we often have a lot of experience of looking after others. But the problem more often is that we have difficulty being compassionate with ourselves. It seems as if there's one rule for us and one rule for everyone else. So everyone else is deserving of things like mercy and forgiveness and compassion, but not us, because guess what? We're these really awful people. So something else I found very helpful is compassion-focused therapy, and this is very much Katie's area of expertise. She's the founder for the Irish Centre for Compassion-Focused Therapy, and she'll be speaking to us in her part of the lecture. And compassion-focused therapy was founded by British psychologist Paul Gilbert as a way of helping those whose depression is maintained by high levels of shame, self-blame, and self-criticism. And of course, if we've grown up with parental alcohol misuse, these are things that we commonly struggle with, and which of course then leave us sitting ducks for depression. So this is a lecture given in August 2018 on compassion-focused therapy. You can access it in the Aware Library of past lectures. And in it, Jared gives us a list of very interesting books on the subject, and also some very, very interesting links to websites on compassion-focused therapy. And in it, he explains to us how our brains work, how they've evolved over time, how we have things called a threat system, a drive system, and a soothing system, and how lots of things influence our brains, including our environment. And Paul Gilbert says that when we've experienced repeated trauma, particularly early in life, we often spend a lot of time in our threat-focused system. So the focus of our attention, our thoughts, feelings, and behaviour can be taken up with fear, danger, and trying to keep ourselves safe. And if you think about it, if we've grown up with parental alcohol misuse, it's not surprising that our threat system is overdeveloped. We needed it at one stage to keep ourselves safe. And it's not surprising that our soothing system might be underdeveloped, because there will have been times we won't felt nourished, cared for, or protected. And all that can help us understand why, as adults, we sometimes have difficulty with hypervigilance. You know, that sense of being on alert and seeing danger where there perhaps isn't any, and also why we can have difficulty trusting people. And compassion-focused therapy refers to that as our tricky brains, and I sometimes think that children of alcoholics have particularly tricky brains. But what I love about compassion-focused therapy is that it shows us that this is not our fault. It's just the way our brains work. And I find that really helpful in alleviating the tendency I have to automatically blame myself in situations. But we now know that the brain is plastic. So even though we've ended up with these particularly tricky brains as a result of growing up with parental alcohol misuse, that's not the end of the story. As adults, we have the power and the capacity to change our brains. And I think that that is an extraordinary message of hope. And compassion-focused therapy and mindfulness are quite closely linked. So together they can be a really, really helpful combination in dampening down that threat system and strengthening our soothing system. So I'll give you an example from compassion-focused therapy that I have found particularly helpful for dealing with shame. So if we look at these 4 statements for a minute: I am worthless, I am inadequate, I'm a failure, I'm a nothing. They have a number of things in common. They all begin with I am. They all relate to who we are. They're all statements about our lack of worth, and they're all negative. But they also contain one other very important feature in common, and that is that they're expressed through language, through words. And yet I discovered that very often if I'm trying to explain how I'm feeling on the inside, that what's happening is that I'm seeing an image and then I'm translating or transcribing that image into words in order to communicate whatever it is I'm feeling. So if we look at that statement again, I am a nothing. This is the image which reflects what I'm feeling on the inside. And I also discovered that I'm very, very sensitive to facial expressions, and that very often it is facial expressions that are the triggers for shame. And it happens so quickly, it's almost subliminal. And it's like being lost in a place with no language. And from observing it, I think that what happens is that it feels like somebody's about to hit me. So I flinch, I think I blink, I freeze, I literally lose my voice. And then there's this drip, 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 sinking feeling. So when I became aware of all that, I began to wonder if images have the potential and the power to be such powerful internal triggers, could other images in some way counteract and neutralize the internal triggers? And yes, it can. And one of the tools that compassion-focused therapy uses is compassionate imagery. So if we look at these compassionate images that I randomly found, on the top we can see a lovely image of an adult bending down to gently kiss the top of a child's head. In the middle there's a lovely image of hands touching, and there's something very powerful about touch. And then the last image is the image of someone meditating. And I think even at this distance you can feel the compassion and the sense of connectedness that that image evokes. So what compassion-focused therapy invites you to do is to find an image which for you evokes compassion. And if it is a human face, it's probably best not to choose a photograph of someone you know and love, because it's difficult to confine an image of someone we know to a single image. So maybe something you find in a magazine or in the internet. And then we give that image, qualities such as compassion, wisdom, understanding, gentleness. And maybe if you want to, you can cut it out and put it on a notice board and, look at it from time to time. And the idea is that that image becomes very familiar to you. And then when you discover that a deep negative belief has been triggered, or if you're just feeling a bit low, that you can bring that image to mind and allow that image to soothe and strengthen you, and most importantly, to strengthen that innate capacity that we have for self-compassion. And I found from using it that I still don't feel great. I think when I started, I thought that one image would literally neutralize the other. It doesn't work that way for me, but what I do find is that it acts like a hammock or a safety net, and that it slows down that sinking feeling, which leaves me vulnerable to depression. So here we have another Aware lecture given by, as you can see, Dr. Katie Baird and her colleague, Dr. Jennifer Gibson. And I chose this lecture for two reasons, one of which was that it's my favourite Aware lecture. But when I chose it as such, I didn't know that Katie would be co-presenting with me. So it's really nice to be able to say to her in person that this really is my favourite Aware lecture. But with this one, I would invite you to do something different. So just, listening to it in the usual way from start to finish, and then just start to listen to it again. And then after about the 15-minute mark, just let what Katie and Jennifer are actually saying fade a little bit into the background, and bring your attention to what are the tone and the volume and the pitch of Jennifer and Katie's voices. And then after another 5 minutes, just turn off the volume altogether and look at Katie and Jennifer as they present the lecture. Because I feel that in presenting this lecture, Katie and Jennifer embody compassionate mindfulness. This is what compassionate mindfulness looks like, and this is what compassionate mindfulness sounds like. And I think if you look at it in this way, you'll agree that compassionate mindfulness looks and sounds an awful lot nicer than that inner critic who sometimes takes up residence in our inner worlds. So that summary are the things that have helped me come through the experience of growing up with parental alcohol misuse. So it's good therapy, medication for a while, mindfulness meditation, and compassion-focused therapy. And I've also done some body work for trauma, which I found very helpful, and I've incorporated that into my mindfulness practice. But when I was looking back, I realized that the common thread between all the things that have helped me has been compassion. From the compassion and empathy I received from my therapist, to taking medication, which for me at that time was an act of self-compassion, to mindfulness meditation and compassion-focused therapy, which in the long term have enabled me to be more compassionate and to relate to myself in a more compassionate way. So you might also find it helpful to read around this subject, though as our next slide shows, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So on our website, we have a list of resources and with a list of books on the subject. You'll find that in the literature, the term used to describe someone who's grown up with parental alcohol misuse is an ACOA, or an adult child of an alcoholic. And if you Google ACOA, you'll come up with a list of personality traits that ACOAs commonly identify with. And I've looked at that list, and yes, I would certainly identify with many of them. But I've often thought it's a little bit negative and maybe reads more like a list of deficits. So out of curiosity, as I was preparing for the lecture, I Googled positive traits of ACOAs. And apart from one or two references to the resilience of ACOAs, nothing came up. And yet, if I think of the ACOAs I actually know, quite different qualities come to my mind. Things like strength, vulnerability, courage, fragility, and compassion. And yes, we do sometimes have difficulty being compassionate with ourselves, but children of alcoholics are very often very forgiving and compassionate people. And it is compassion which underpins the work of Silent Voices. We want to expand the conversation around the problem we have with alcohol in Ireland to include the voice of those who grew up with parental alcohol misuse and who live with that legacy. And we also want to become a voice for those who currently have no voice, the estimated 200,000 children growing up in our midst who we know from our own experience are suffering so terribly and in silence. But if we want to become that voice, we have to find our own voices. And in order to find our own voices, we need to give ourselves and each other permission to break the 3 cardinal rules by which we grew up, namely, don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. And on that note, I'd like to bring my presentation to a close by leaving you with a poem I wrote to try and articulate and convey how difficult it is to break the silence of the alcoholic home. When I tell you for the first time that I grew up in an alcoholic home, please realize how much courage it has taken me to tell you, and how frightened I am my family will discover I have spoken to you. When I begin to slowly walk the long road to trusting you, be patient with me, and when I give you my trust, please appreciate the gift I have given you. Because I had to play happy families all my life, I smile on the outside and I cry on the inside. I am terrified of anger and so afraid that if I start to cry, I may never be able to stop. When I stop smiling, please hold me. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, for that lovely endorsement of my work. Don't get to hear things like that very often, so it's really nice. Thank you. I'm Katie Baird, and I am the director and founder of the Irish Centre for Compassion-Focused Therapy, which is a growing independent practice that came about because when I first learned about compassion-focused therapy, I was a counselling psychologist. I was actually working here in St. Pat's. And over the years, as I trained more, learned more about CFT, and worked with more people with CFT, I began to want to do that more and more and do other things that were part of my role less and less. So I decided to leave and just do nothing but CFT in my professional life. But I guess something that was really true about what Barbara said was that when you move into this world of CFT and compassion, it really does become much more than just a job or just a professional role. And I do think that I try to live what I do with my clients, and I try to embody compassion. So just to say a little bit about myself, before I move into talking, I'm not an expert on addiction or parental alcohol misuse or adult children of alcoholics, but I am someone who works every day with people who've lived that life, who've experienced the emotional abuse and neglect that can go along with that. And I've just up here a few books that have influenced me. Now, the one on the far right is for professionals, and it's for professionals who are coming to CFT from a CBT background. It explains some of the differences and the key learnings of Paul Gilbert, the founder of CFT, who found that again and again as he worked with people using cognitive behavioral therapy, it's not about saying that CBT isn't a good therapy. It's a really good therapy. But there's a group of people who, even though they learn to challenge their thoughts, even though they're really doing what their therapists ask, they're having that experience of invalidation in therapy. And it often turns out that when they challenge their negative automatic thoughts, they're doing it in a very harsh, critical way, because that's the normal way that they talk to themselves. So compassion-focused therapy teaches us, and compassionate mind training, which is a way to engage with compassion and mindfulness without doing therapy. They teach us to talk to ourselves and be with ourselves in a very different way. And the other two books that are up there are, one is by Paul Gilbert and a former Buddhist monk, Choden, Mindful Compassion. This is a lovely book for helping anyone begin to move into that realm of compassionate mindfulness. So there's a lot of personal disclosures by both of them, as well as lovely practices that you can engage with. The other book is one of the most recent books in the world of compassion-focused therapy and compassionate mind training. And it's by Chris Irons, and it is the latest of a series of books. So the Compassionate Mind Foundation puts out books for people who want to work with many, many different mental health issues using compassion. Depression, anxiety, eating issues, trauma, and now difficult emotions as well, because the essence of doing compassion for ourselves involves moving towards our emotions, even when they're very difficult. And why would we do this? So one of the reasons we do this is because compassion is an antidote to shame. Many of our problems that cause us to suffer as humans, whether that suffering results in a diagnosis or whether we just kind of suffer through each day on our own, shame maintains these issues. And I think Barbara was really eloquent about how that experience can be so overwhelming and make it so hard to keep going and resist kind of falling back in to depression or panic or an eating disorder. And when I think about shame for people who grew up in family where there was alcohol misuse, I think of this man, John Bradshaw. And I guess decades ago, when I was first learning how to be a mental health professional, he was really popular in America, where I grew up. He was a person who came out of that ACOA movement, but he wrote a lot and talked a lot about shame. And this quote, I think, where he talks about how people can learn to feel ashamed of any of their basic drives or feelings or needs, I think really encapsulates how a person can be just completely bound up in shame, so that when they even just think a thought or want to do something, they feel shame. And that's the experience of many people I work with. And actually, it's one of those things about therapy that when you start to do it, you might feel worse before you feel better. Because as they start to own their emotions and drives and needs and preferences and just the things they want in life, they get this overwhelming sense of shame, because that's what they learn to associate with being a human being and just having these normal wants and feelings. So we need compassion. And another quote from the Dalai Lama, like in Barbara's presentation, is he reminds us that love and compassion, they're not luxuries, they're necessities. Without them, we cannot survive. So what do we really mean when we talk about compassion? We have many kind of everyday associations to compassion, but in compassionate mind training and compassion-focused therapy, there are two parts to it, both really important. So we talk about being sensitive to suffering, so being willing to notice and engage with it, not move away from it or try to numb it or pretend it's not there, to really notice and engage with it. And also to be willing to commit to try and alleviate it or prevent it. And that's our own suffering and sometimes the suffering of other people when we choose. But if your compassion doesn't include you, it's not compassion. So Paul Gilbert, who we've both named the developer of CFT and compassionate mind training, says compassionate mind training is like physiotherapy for the mind. And I really like this quote because, you know, when you have an injury or you're hurt and you have to go to a physiotherapist, and it's kind of okay when you're there, but when you leave, you have this list of exercises that you need to do, and you know that they're going to kind of hurt and be really effortful, but you need to do them if you want to heal, if you want to feel better. And it's a bit like that with compassionate mindfulness. It takes a kind of effort and discipline, and you have to kind of really get into drive to do it. And it does bring up painful feelings. But just like physiotherapy, it helps you heal. So I wanted to say a little bit about research and science, not just because I'm a psychologist and we really like to talk about that stuff, sometimes people have a bit of a block to compassion and they think it's this kind of fluffy thing, and isn't that well for some to kind of sit around being nice to themselves? That's not really what we're talking about. Compassionate mind training and CFT come out of many different fields of study: neuroscience, human development, Buddhist psychology, evolutionary biology, and Jungian psychology, and there's also this growing body of research to support it. So these are just some of the studies. This is not all of them, but some of them are observational, so they follow people doing CFT or compassionate mind training, and then they look at the changes that happen after. And others are controlled studies. So some people are doing compassionate mindfulness practices and other people are doing something else, often medication maintenance or other forms of therapy. And all of these studies have shown that people who are willing to do this work, do this physiotherapy for their minds, they begin to feel better and recover more than people who aren't doing it. And just some other important research I just want to briefly touch on, kind of again mirroring, I guess, what Barbara said. What we know is that growing up in a home where your emotional needs aren't met or where you're neglected, that predicts depression. And that particularly predicts that anhedonia or loss of pleasure that's such a painful part of depression. And this new research by Cohen and colleagues shows that actually that experience predicts depression more than physical or sexual abuse. So not saying that those aren't horrible traumatic experiences, they are, but that research really gives me pause to think about these more kind of sometimes called silent abuses have such far-reaching effects. And Barbara also mentioned Mark Williams, and here's some research by Mark Williams and his colleagues, and Willem Kijken, who is one of his colleagues. And they were interested in comparing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to treatment as usual or medication maintenance in the prevention of relapse for depression. And what they found was that for people who had had early childhood adversity, like growing up in a home where there was addiction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy was actually just as good as medication. So again, no one's trying to say that medication isn't good. It's really helpful and important a lot of the time. But I think that their research shows that there is an alternative for people who choose not to do that. And then that final study is just really recent research out of Iceland, where people were randomly assigned to either mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or compassion-focused therapy or treatment as usual with medication. And what they found, not surprisingly, the people who did MBCT and CFT had more mindfulness and they were more compassionate. But they also had just the same results in terms of depression. So how do we do this? If the benefits are this good, how do we begin to bring this into our lives? And I suppose one of the first principles we learn in compassionate mindfulness is that our attention is like a spotlight. We have this inbuilt capacity to move our attention, but we also have a really strong threat system that can grab it and hold it. So we have to learn to move, to think about our attention like a spotlight. Whatever we shine it on is going to grow in our awareness, and everything else is going to fade into the background. It's a really good way of understanding why we can get so stuck on a negative thought when there's actually really positive things happening around us, because we get stuck with it and we grow it in our awareness. And I'm just going to show a really brief video to say a little bit more about what this is like with images instead of words. So I really like that video, and there's so many, I think, useful messages in it. One of them I really like is how frustrated he gets with all the flies, and I'm thinking about people who are very high in self-criticism, that I'm one of them, and that we always blame ourselves that we have these flies, we have these thoughts buzzing around or worries buzzing around, and actually that's not our fault. And that's what this next slide is about, that as Barbara said, in the world of compassion, we think about 3 systems. And the first of these to develop in humans and other animals was the threat system. So it's very powerful, and it operates on a better safe than sorry principle, and it always will. So even the Dalai Lama talks about getting into threat and getting so angry that he smashes things that he's trying to fix. So someone who spends his life in a contemplative tradition can still get an amygdala hijack. That makes me feel a little bit better about it happening to me. So we have these really strong threat systems. We're really prone to strong emotions like anger and fear, anxiety, some kind of sadness, guilt and shame, and we don't choose that. We don't get a choice about that as humans. We also have really powerful drive systems. So this is the system that helps us achieve and work towards our goals. And the emotions, if we have a healthy drive system, are pride and exhilaration when things are going well. The problem with this for many of us is that we spend all of our time in either threat or drive, and we don't spend enough time in soothing after we're about maybe 5 or 6, if you're lucky. So in the soothing picture there's a lovely image of a baby lying comfortably on her dog, or his dog. I think it's a girl. I think it's pink. And this is a lovely image of soothing and feeling safe and just content with the world. And this system evolved in us to help us manage the other 2. But we really have to work to bring it online. And a lot of times we don't spend enough time doing that. Again, that's not our fault. Most of us were not encouraged to do that. I remember when I was first learning about this stuff with a colleague, she said in her family, and I didn't realize it, but mine was the same, you have a threat, you get into drive and you do something about it, and then many days or many hours later, you might allow yourself a very brief window of soothing. In my house, how that worked when I was growing up was school was tough for me. I'm quite introverted and it's just noisy and lots of people. And I'd come home and the first thing I'd have to do is my homework. And then after that, I could play or have a snack or chill out. But soothing was a reward for drive. And actually that's not how it's meant to be. In order to be healthy and flourish, we need a balance of these three systems. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the learning that children who grow up in homes where there's addiction or substance misuse. And I guess one really important thing we know from developmental neuroscientists is that children are learning before they have language. We're laying down connections in our neural pathways, and we don't even know that we're doing that. We wouldn't even be able to articulate what it was that we're learning. So just as that baby is learning the world is safe and predictable and I'm okay here, this little girl is learning something very different. But she may not be able to talk about that and indeed have words for it. Also, as children, we need other people to soothe us. And we need them to help us learn about emotions and learn to soothe ourselves. We're born with this soothing system, this innate capacity to soothe ourselves, but we don't know how to access it until someone helps us learn. And we need support for our emotional development. Just like children need support for their physical development and their cognitive development, they need support for their emotional development. And if you didn't get this in life, it's not your fault. We need to feel loved, and research actually shows that we need to see delight in the faces of the people who give care to us. There's a part of our brain that only gets stimulated by that. So it can't even begin to develop until we get that experience. So as we know, the reality is not all children get this. And if your needs were not met, it might be very difficult to soothe yourself. You might have internalized negative messages, and you might have a really hard time being gentle or supportive or understanding with yourself. And again, a really big message in the world of compassion is, this is not your fault. It really isn't your fault. And yet, it is your responsibility to do something about it if you want to feel better. So in CFT, we come to understand, or in compassionate mind training, that our minds are really like gardens. We can choose not to do anything with them, and that's fine. That's fine. Sometimes we'll have beautiful wildflowers that just come, and sometimes the weeds that grow will bloom and be quite beautiful and smell nice. But also, it's going to be pretty wild and at times very difficult to navigate. Or we can choose to cultivate our minds in compassion or mindfulness, or both, and then we have a very different kind of garden. And I just want to almost leave you, with a quote from the Compassionate Mind Foundation, which is Paul Gilbert's foundation, who do really important work around the world, not only training professionals, but trying to bring compassion to government, to business, to huge problems of living in the world. And I'm just going to read this kind of slowly so you can let it sink in. So compassion is one of the most important declarations of strength and courage known to humanity. It is difficult and powerful, infectious and influential. It's a universally recognized motivation with the ability to change the world. And I guess what we're talking about tonight is beginning to change the world by just changing your own mind. So I'd like to take just a moment to invite everyone to maybe just put something down if you've been writing and just take a breath. And just feel what that is like, just to breathe. Along with the tricky brains that nature and evolution have given us, they've given us this innate capacity to soothe ourselves with our breath. So just notice what's happening as you inhale and exhale. And see if you can let your breath settle. And maybe your body can even begin to find a rhythm where you breathe in and breathe out for an equal amount of time. Not worrying about how long that is or how deep your breath is, because that doesn't actually matter. What matters is that you can find a rhythm that's even and smooth. If you like, you can even imagine the breath coming and going from your heart. So just notice what happens as you do that. And then come back to the group and to this evening, and I'd just like to leave by asking you to think about how your day might be if you did that a few more times during the day. And we're not even talking about long times. I try to get the people I work with to think about 3 to 5 minutes a day. But as we've just experienced, I think even just slowing down for a few seconds can have a really big effect. And if you enjoyed that experience, there are just some cards here. They're not my card or anything. They're just cards that say on them, breathe rhythmically, evenly, and through the heart every day. And that's an acronym to help you breathe in that way. So the first letter of each of those words spells out breathe. So breathe rhythmically, evenly, and through the heart every day. Thank you.